formación profesional. La primera.
Okay, I guess we're going to begin now. Hello, everybody. I will give the floor to Manuel Peña. He's a member of assistant of our CEAS. Please, Manuel.
Okay, good morning, everybody. First of all, we're going to start with Maria Sterlo. She's a member of the CEAS. She's a researcher, an economist, and she's going to be commenting this. She's going to be moderating this conference first. So she's going to start giving some words.
Thank you, Manuel. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Professor Amit. Good morning to all. It is my pleasure to be the moderator of today's conference and to have Professor Amitendu Palit, expert on India-China relations, countries that I had the opportunity to visit thanks to scholarships. I did my master's degree in China at Beijing Normal University on business administration, and also visited India this year for a complete month to do a course program in economics in the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS. Well, I would like to introduce Dr. Palit. Dr. Palit is Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economics at the Institute of South Asian Studies of the National University of Singapore. He's an economist specializing in international trade and investment policies, FTAs, supply chains, connectivity, cross-border data flows, and the India economy. He sits on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Trade and Investment. He is Senior Research Fellow Honorary at the WUN Center for Study of NNCs and advisor for Athena Infonomics. Earlier, Dr. Amitendu worked for several years in the Ministry of Finance, Government of India, and in the Ministries of Industry and Civil Supplies. He handled macroeconomic policies, including trade, investment, industrial development, SMEs, entrepreneurship, and futures trading. He wrote annual economic surveys and participated in annual budgetary consultations. He was on advisory committees of the Planning Commission for India and the ILO. Dr. Amitendu has edited and authored several books. So I would like to, well, now I give the floor to the coordinator of the Center of Asian Studies, Professor Carlos Aquino, to give some words. Please, Professor Carlos Aquino.
Thanks, Maria. Good morning, Professor Amitendu Palit. Good night, good evening over there. You are very kind to have accepted our conference. Just brief words about our center. The Center of Asian Studies of San Marcos National University was created just 1 year and 10 months ago. And our aim is to do research about this very important region of Asia that each time is becoming even more important for Peru. Yes, before beginning formally this conference, I was telling Professor Amitendu how much important Asia and particularly China is becoming. Okay, so this is a very important region. We need to do a lot of research on that. And also we want to propose public policy to our government so we can have a better relationship with that important region. This conference touched in a very important point. China and India are two countries, and as many project, probably in the next 20, 30 years, they will be among the 2-3 biggest countries in the world. So to know the relationship between these countries is every more important. Okay. So we're very happy to have Professor Amitendu, and this is the first conference in September. We have several conferences in September, so hope everybody here in the auditorium also will accompany us in the next conference. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Aquino. So after Professor's Palit conference, we will have some comments given also by Professor Aquino, and after that, the round of questions. So without more to say, I give the floor to Professor Palit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would like to start by first wishing you a very good morning. And we are in very difficult times all across the world. So I wish all of you stay safe, stay healthy. But I think one of the good parts of the development around us has been that it has given us all an opportunity to reach out to each other through the cyberspace in different corners of the world. Perhaps we would have found it difficult to meet each other if this pandemic had not broken out and if we had not taken to Zoom or other forums as one of the ways of organizing virtual meetings and conferences. So I'd like to thank the National University of San Marcos and the Center for Asian Studies, Professor Carlos Aquino. Thank you so much for your generous invitation. Thank you, Professor Maria, for agreeing to chair the session today. I'm going to speak on the India-China relations and the new developments and implications of those developments. And as Professor Carlos mentioned, China and India are not just two very big countries by themselves, but they are also in a very interesting bilateral relationship with each other because they are neighbors. They have a very long border, which is a historical border shared by these two countries. They have been sharing a large part of common geographical territory in the Himalayas for a very, very long period of time in history, for centuries altogether. They have had historical exchanges, communications, movements between the two countries. But over the last 70 to 80 years, and this is primarily after the Second World War, there have been more histories of confrontation between the two countries, which essentially was in the decade of the 1960s when there were military conflicts, following which there was a secession in diplomatic relationships between the two countries. But then again, these diplomatic relations were revived from the late 70s. Formal diplomatic relations in a fairly comprehensive fashion were restored from the middle of the 1980s. And since then, India and China have continued a policy of engagement, primarily through economics and business, but also through a shared history of contribution when it comes to a large number of global issues, primarily in the area of climate change and sustainable development. However, this has not meant that the two countries have been able to overcome their differences. And their differences have continued to remain, primarily because of two reasons. The first is the outstanding bilateral differences over the resolution of territories on the border in the Himalayas, on which the countries have been discussing in a structured fashion for several years. But unfortunately, till now, the border issue between the two countries has remained unresolved. At the same time, adding to the bilateral complications has been a host of developments which are taking place around India and China and within India and China itself. And these primarily relate to the ambitions of the two countries as their economies have been expanding, as their outreach has been expanding, as they begin to exert and realize the fact that they have really become important strategic actors in the global order and the regional order. And as a result of that, both countries have started experiencing each other's strategic ambitions and aspirations in a way that is not always comfortable for each other. Of course, when it comes to economic size and probably in terms of the other elements that go into the making of a major power, China is ahead of India in most respects. But the fact remains that India is a sufficiently big country, a large country with a commanding presence in terms of the geography that it has, in terms of the number of people that it has, in terms of the contributions that it has been making to several sectors of the world economy. And all these make the India-China relationship an extremely important bilateral relationship. And that bilateral relationship, in terms of what it experiences, has implications for practically the all of the world. So their mutual relations and their impact is not just limited to Asia and the neighborhood, but perhaps other parts of the world, including Europe, including Americas, tend to be somewhat influenced by what is going on in this relationship in some way or other. So what I'll do is that I will very briefly take you through a series of recent developments in the India-China relations, which are all the related developments that have happened after the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And these have all basically happened over the last few months. So as you would see in the screen that I'm sharing with you, over the last 4 to 5 years, there have been more than one instance of the troops from both countries, the military forces, facing off each other on their borders in the Himalayas. These have been increasing in number over the last 4 to 5 years. But the interesting point is that there never was as such a military confrontation. But this year, on the 5th of May, 2020, from the 5th of May, there was a face-off that began with militaries, armed forces taking their positions on both sides of the line of actual control in the Himalayan Indian state of Ladakh. And on the 15th or 16th of June, around the midnight of the crossover time, there were actually military clashes, which resulted in casualties on both sides, around 20 casualties on part of India, more than 40 from China in terms of the reported numbers. Now, this was quite an extraordinary development because over the last 45 years or more, there really has not been a military confrontation between the two countries, which has led to loss of lives. So in many ways, this was probably the worst conflict, the worst military conflict or clash that happened between these two countries. And that clearly has left an impact on the relationship. Now, since this happened and both countries have been practical, pragmatic, and responsible enough to understand that there is probably not much point in allowing the hostilities and confrontation to escalate. And it is probably best to ensure that the difficulties, for whatever reasons they have arisen, whichever side might be responsible for the provocation, it's best to settle the matter through diplomatic channels and communications. So as a first step towards that, they have been talking to each other bilaterally for military disengagement, which is basically a pullback of forces from the borders on the both sides. However, such disengagement in the area of confrontation, the geographical space over which this has been happening, is not yet fully complete. So military presence continues to remain there. The line of actual control between the two countries continue to remain a tense area in the sense that not everything has cooled off, not everything is in a state of stability. There's more tension in a sense which is arising because of the fact that this is happening, that particular part of the border between the two countries is very close to the autonomous region of Tibet in China, which has always been a source of complication for Chinese internal administration and management. And Tibet has typically been an area of persistent difference between the two countries as well, with India being sympathetic to the Tibetan cause for democracy and independence, and having sheltered the Dalai Lama for several years. And at the same time, the US-China tensions, which really have been ratcheting over the last 7 or 8 months since the outbreak of the COVID-19 and the closing down of the US elections, that has begun affecting probably a large number of perspectives on the on the India-China side, insofar as viewing each other is concerned, because the impact of this US-China tensions is also being felt in the Asia-Pacific region quite severely. One doesn't really know when this standoff is going to end, when the relationships might begin to the normal diplomatic level. There is a possibility that the defense ministers and the foreign ministers of both countries might come to meet each other very soon at the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a forum which comprises both India and China. But whether those meetings will happen and whether those meetings will actually result in a comprehensive disengagement and return of a certain phase of maybe fragile, but nonetheless normalcy along the border, is something that we will have to wait and watch. But these developments have had their reactions. The first round of reactions, and let me cover the reactions that have come from India. India on this particular occasion has been noticeable in taking a position which is fairly, I would describe as strong, in terms of similar positions which have probably been taken by India in the past, that these are fairly strong positions which India have taken. And these positions have been taken primarily in the economic area. And I think the thinking here has been on part of the Indian decision makers, that the India-China economic relationship is a fairly substantial and comprehensive economic relationship, particularly when it comes to trade. India's dependence on China in matters of trade as a source of raw materials and intermediates, and also a very large number of essential capital goods, machineries, and consumer goods, is fairly large. The bilateral trade relationship between China and India is very much tilted in favor of China. India runs a very large trade deficit with respect to China. And there has been a feeling in some quarters that because this dependency is very large, because this trade relationship is very one-sided, it is very difficult for India to take steps which will reflect a strong attitude towards China. And that would, in a sense, probably limit India from taking strong positions from a geopolitical and strategic perspective. So this is appearing to be one occasion when India is trying to break out of that limitation, which might have come in some respect. And the reactions that are coming in terms of specific policies are first, restricting Chinese investments. And these are coming as part of policies that have been announced by India in terms of investments from countries having land borders with India being put through particular additional layers of scrutiny and review. These haven't really been banned, but they're just being reviewed far more carefully than in the past to ensure that these investments, and the focus is clearly on the Chinese investments, that they don't in any way get to a position where they control assets which might compromise India's national security interests in any way. So these are particularly relevant for strategic sectors like, say, for example, telecommunications, ports, infrastructure, and such areas. Well, at this stage, it appears that the Chinese 5G frontrunner Huawei, which has been a serious contender for the 5G equipment supply when India opens its tenders for 5G provision in the country. I don't think Huawei has the possibility anymore of going ahead. So that is going to be an area of fairly significant limitation. Many of you might be aware of the Indian Premier League in the sport of cricket, which is an extremely popular, very large sponsorship and revenue generating event that happens in India. This year, because of the COVID, it has been shifted to the United Arab Emirates. But the sponsorship of the Indian Premier League used to be with the Vivo, a prominent Chinese company, which has withdrawn from that sponsorship. And most significantly, this is in fact being described as a very significant step by India insofar as limiting Chinese influence in India is concerned. 118 apps containing various popular Chinese apps like, say, for example, TikTok, WeChat, Alipay, PUBG, and so on and so forth have been banned by India. And this, in an effect, targets the developers of these apps, which are all major Chinese companies practically present all over the world in the digital space, like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance, and their products have been banned. Not that they were making very huge revenues in India, but they did really have fairly strong following from within the country, particularly gaming apps like the PUBG, for example. And this is intended to send a very clear signal to the Chinese developers and the Chinese businesses that when it comes to the digital space, and which is now being visualized as a space where there is sufficient scope for compromise on national security concerns, particularly through the cybersecurity threats, India is going to be very, very careful when it comes to allowing the Chinese digital apps. In a couple of other developments, the Chinese cultural institutes and forums, which have traditionally been engaging in bilateral people-to-people connectivity building and contact building, are being increasingly more scrutinized in terms of the purposes which they have and the intentions which they convey. And finally, this is actually going to be a very significant development according to my understanding, and we can discuss this further in future. India has really begun very serious efforts to work with what I would describe, quote unquote, like-minded countries to reposition supply chains within the Asia Pacific. And this is really coming out again out of an understanding that it is not just India, but it is also several other countries of the world like Japan, Australia, Korea, and obviously not to mention the United States of America, which do realize that when it comes to the major supply chains, like, say, for example, semiconductor, electronics, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, and even other consumer products like garments, textiles, chemicals, and the most new generation cutting edge industries like electric vehicles, China continues to retain fairly substantial parts of these supply chains, either at the upstream level or at the downstream level. And as a result of that, there is a dependency on China which arises, even when there is no national security interest involved, even from a purely economic perspective. There is a dependency which major economies of the world continue to have on China. So even if it's a situation where there is no security issue involved, but simply a disruption arising out of a public health exigency like the COVID-19, and there are disruptions within China, the supply chains completely get disturbed. and the access to vital products on part of these countries get disturbed in a very, very quick fashion. So it's basically with that objective, and also to ensure that there is much lesser dependence on China economically, which in a sense would reduce the risks of dealing with an aggressive China in several respects, which might create national security concerns for these countries. India is working with Japan and Australia to promote what is being described as a resilient supply chain initiative. And there are countries like Korea and Vietnam and other countries from Southeast Asia, which are also expected to contribute to this. So we might actually get to see a fairly significant reshuffling of investments within the Asia Pacific and a repositioning of supply chains as we go ahead and we discuss much more about this. When it comes to responses from China, there are hardly much bilateral actions that I am aware of which have been specifically targeted at India. But the Chinese press and the general view held by China has been that most of India's actions has been because of the US pressure which is being employed on it to act aggressively on China, and as a result of the developments that's taking place on the border. But there are other efforts that are clearly visible in terms of China trying to consolidate its deeper engagement with the neighboring countries around India in a bid to consolidate its strategic influence in the neighborhood, which has actually been quite substantial over the years. So there have been meetings between countries like Afghanistan, Nepal, and Pakistan with China. These are countries to whom China is a very important provider of development assistance, particularly infrastructure building assistance through the One Belt and One Road program. And China continues to assure its commitment to the development needs of these countries by actually reaching out to them even within the situation of COVID-19 crisis. On the whole, as such, China, in terms of its greater space of the restructuring of the economic policies, is actually increasingly beginning to shift towards an economic model which aims to reduce its dependence on the rest of the world, on external demand. And this is essentially looking to build the Chinese economy more as a self-sustaining economy by itself. And many of you might be aware of the fact that the 14th five-year plan of China is expected to be adopted by the CCP in the month of October. And this, in fact, will be the first five-year plan which is going to come in after China has achieved its first centennial objective of getting out of absolute poverty and ensuring a moderate level of prosperity to most of its people. So this plan is critical in terms of signaling what China intends to do in order to maintain its economic position and influence and sustenance over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And there is expected to be the announcement of a policy of dual circulation, which is expected to be a policy that in a sense emphasizes on China's capturing the most from global markets in a selective fashion, but at the same time, emphasizing very heavily on developing its internal markets and institutions and capacities for building up enough capacity, so much so that China reduces its dependence on selling competitive exports to the rest of the world. And there are also efforts to introduce digital currency by the Chinese central bank. This is where China is expected to be the first of the bloc. And it's quite clear that China looks at the fascinating growth in the global digital economy that has been happening as one of the areas where it can contribute substantively in terms of the efforts that it has been undertaking. It might even go on to actually propose the CBDC as one of the ways in which the yuan or the RMB can be pitched into an alternative reserve currency vis-a-vis the US dollar or along with the US dollar in the years to come. Finally, from a purely India-China bilateral relation perspective, if one looks at the global and regional impacts, the border issues, irrespective of the discussions that take place at the minister level, irrespective of the other general conditions, even if they don't flare up, the border issue is unlikely to get resolved very quickly unless India and China are actually able to work out a structured mechanism through which they can reach an end to this problem in a manner which is of complete mutual satisfaction to both sides. Now, how that will be reached is a matter of speculation. I would not like to speculate on that because this is a subject on which years and decades have been spent by diplomats and experts. But the border issue is likely to remain as an area of friction, which is going to flare up time and again. So this is going to remain a contentious area. And as a result of this particular problem and the general tensions between China and India, as both of them exert their strategic influence over their respective neighborhoods, which are each other's neighborhoods also, in the sense that much as India is a part of South Asia, China, because of its sheer size, also considers South Asia as its neighborhood or periphery. And in a similar way, India also considers parts of Southeast Asia around the Bay of Bengal and beyond as part of its periphery. And both are keen to retain their respective strategic, geopolitical, and geoeconomic influences in these areas, which they look as their neighborhood. And that is occasionally going to run into conflict with each other's interests and plans and perspectives. And as a result, the South Asian region is likely to become tense and volatile as these two major powers continue to remain in a state of off and on friction between each other. Like South Asia, developments might also get a bit more complicated around the South China Sea in Southeast Asia, because out there China has disputed maritime borders pending with a large number of countries in the region, Malaysia, for example. So there might also be complications which are developing around that. As it is right now, the South China Sea is already in the middle of a fair bit of naval military buildup, as we are getting to see. In a greater sense, and this is looking at both the global and regional impacts, I suppose the India-China relationship is going to contribute to certain polarizations that are quite imminent. And one of these is what I mentioned, that of the repositioning of supply chains, where India is looking to work with a group of like-minded countries, Japan, Australia, Korea, Vietnam, the United States, to snatch and shift some production of the major supply chains out of China. But in a similar way, one can expect that China is also going to make efforts to ensure that it continues to retain sufficient control over supply chains, even if those chains need to be reconfigured and repositioned. And China already has this basic model of the Belt and Road on which to work on. So one might actually get to see that supply chains in future are not just going to be positioned on the basis of economic efficiency, but they're also going to be positioned on the basis of mutual trust and security considerations. And then one might get to see that the Belt and Road space, the economic geography of the Belt and Road, covers a particular group of supply chains, whereas there are other supply chains in other zones, maybe in the Indo-Pacific or other areas. Again, this entails a fairly distinct polarization according to the global political order that determines the fixing of the supply chains. What is also likely to happen, and this is where India and China both share in terms of their economic size and the space they occupy in the global population, is going to have an impact when it comes to polarization over the COVID-19 vaccine distribution, because much as there is a global race for vaccines, I think both India and China are the largest markets for consumption of these vaccines. India has a decisive advantage insofar as producing the vaccines are concerned, the mass vaccines. But at the same time, there could well be a situation of vaccine nationalism and its strategic polarization. So India and China are likely to work with their respective allies to ensure that there is a relatively aligned distribution of vaccines when the vaccines become available. There's also expected to be some polarization on which India and China respectively might contribute when it comes to digital outreach and the data standards. By now, it's pretty clear that Huawei and ZTE and the Chinese 5G companies are not going to get preferred access or competitive access in a large number of markets of the world, but there are other several large markets of the world where they might get such access. So there's going to be a polarization in that respect. There's going to be a polarization with respect to the way data standards are being worked out, because China and India have had fairly distinct positions in this regard. And finally, to my mind, what remains a fairly critical short-term factor is the outcome of the US elections, because much as the US-China relationship has now reached a stage where the hostility or the lack of trust is almost bipartisan, if one can describe it that way, at least as far as the US political system is concerned. But there's also this tendency that domestic elections and domestic political imperatives make certain rhetorics very essential. One should not lose sight of the fact that US and China have already entered into a trade deal, but there are a large number of contentious steps and policy issues that are happening between the two countries, primarily from the US side. Now, whether this narrative is going to change following the outcome of the US elections is something which will remain very critical, because if there is a little bit of a sobering down in this hostile narrative, then it's likely to have a fairly virtuous effect on the Asia-Pacific region and in terms of the relationships that one is getting to see. These are some of the observations that I thought I would share with you, and I hope I have been able to gather some of your thoughts together in this regard in terms of the bigger impacts that we can get to feel and experience as a result of the current state of affairs in the India-China relations. And I'm very happy to listen to your comments and answer any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Amitendu Palit, for this insightful and wonderful conference. Before starting with the comments, I would like to greet and say thanks to the Embassy of India, Ambassador Elar Escala, Ambassador of Indonesia, Marina Estela Anwar, and Professor Hyosam Lim for joining us in this opportunity. Now, without more to say, I give the floor to Professor Kino to give the respective comments, and then we have the round of questions.
Thanks, Mary. And thanks, Professor Amitendu Palit. Very, very comprehensive conference. You have covered practically all the aspects of the complex India-China relationship. As you rightly said, these two countries have a very, very big, important relationship that have a very big impact in the Asian region. Asian region is the center of the world economy, and is becoming the center also, is going to become the center of political power. So these two big actors, is very important to know what's happening between them. Yeah, it's a very complex relationship. They have share a frontier, a very big one, and still some part of that frontier is not being delimited. They have this actual line of control, and the another McMahon line that is not well defined yet. And also, as you rightly said, there are some countries around that area, specifically, for example, Pakistan, for example, that have a very complex relationship with India. And that is a point probably also of problem with India, because some people said that perhaps India could be involved in a two-front conflict, not only China, but also Pakistan. And that's bring to me a question that I want to make also, Professor. You know, Russia, for example, have had a very strong relationship with India. Russia have been the main supplier of military equipment to India, but as we also know, Russia is a very close friend of China. So in the last 2-3 years, we have seen that India is having a very close relationship with the United States, and Mr. President Trump was in India this January, visiting India, and some people are saying that perhaps India is going to become more close to United States. Well, you know, United States, India, Japan, and Australia are together in this so-called quadrilateral security arrangement. So probably they said India will become more close to United States. Even they are talking that they have recently, from some years ago, this Malabar naval exercise. The United States traditionally is participating there. Probably Australia is going to join that, and perhaps Japan is going to join that. So my first question will be, do you think this Quad relationship is going to become more stronger? Even in this Monday, I guess, there was a meeting between high government officials from the United States and India. I was reading in this paper that the Deputy Secretary of State was participating, and he even proposed a kind of NATO alliance, really, a defensive agreement between United States, India, Japan, and Australia. So what will be the implication in that case, okay? So this is first. The second thing that I find very interesting, and you have also said, we're talking now about this big conflict between China and United States. We're talking about the coupling of China and United States economy. So some people said that this could present a big chance for India, really, for some companies that want to move from China. Perhaps they could go to India. And yeah, it could be the case because India have a very big pool of labor force. The reason first that was why many companies went to China to establish a manufacturing operation there. But I guess India still have a problem, as you know, this physical infrastructure. It's not only enough to have cheap labor force, but also physical infrastructure. In that sense, China have gone ahead. That's very interesting. I was reading, for example, that in 1980, China and India have nearly the same economic size, okay? Just 40 years ago, India and China have nearly the same economic size. But now, as you know, India is lagging behind China. China economic size is nearly 5 times the size of India. So India have a lot to catch up, but of course there is an opportunity there. Also in China, the salaries are increasing, so India can take advantage of that, especially as you also mentioned, not in Asia, but also in the United States, they are trying to, as they said, find another kind of supply chain, not centered in China, but also in another region. So India can have a chance to grab that opportunity. So my second question is, really, will it be India able to take advantage of this economic decoupling to constitute another, not alternative, but perhaps together with the India central supply chain, another supply chain center in India? Because not only is the concern of the United States, even Japan said we have too much dependence on Japan, and even Australia. You know, Australia in the last days, they have some kind of economic conflict with China also. So I guess, again, these Quad countries, these 4 countries have a common interest, not only in the defense aspect, but also in the economic aspect, to be less relevant in China. And the last thing that I want to address is the question is, you know, China and India are 2 big countries. I always tell my students the impressive economic growth in the last 40 years of China, it is not so impressive if we take into consideration that during much time of the last 2000 years, China was a big economic power, but also India. Many people forget that. Many people forget that from the probably 3rd, 4th century up to the beginning of the 18th century, China and India were the 2 big economic powers in the world. So it will be very interesting to see how these countries will behave in the future. I guess the room for cooperation is very big, really. They have both big internal markets, as you already said. For example, in the case of China, in the last years, they are being focusing in the internal market because they don't want to be more dependent on the external market. And one of the reasons is that they have developed already a very big middle class, and I guess this is also one very strong point of India. All predictions said that in the next, even in the next 15 years, India could even have a bigger middle class than China, really. So I guess even if they are 2 competitors, perhaps there could be some room for cooperation. But in that case, perhaps it's something that you know. Up to last year, there was a scheme, economic scheme, integration scheme in East Asia to have this regional comprehensive economic partnership, okay, involving the ASEAN group of 10 countries plus 6 United States, China, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and India. But India left this agreement. So it is supposed that in November, probably, this RCP is going to enter into effect, or it's going to be signed, but sadly, India is not there. So it is a pity that, of course, India has their own national interests. India thought that perhaps it is not convenient, at least now, to enter in this agreement, but it could have been a very good integration scheme that will further advance cooperation between these 2 economic giants that are India and China. Anyway, that's my point, and I give you the floor, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Carlos. These are excellent observations. I will respond to all of your queries, but I would like to sort of share with you in the beginning that since I am primarily an economist and I work on economic issues, so I will not be very competent to respond to one of your questions, which is more from a strategic perspective and a security perspective. But let me try to reflect on that, the first question that you raised, and you raised the very important point about the role that Russia has to play in the current interface between India and China, and also the importance of the Quad countries and India's greater proximity with the United States. I think we, in many respects, and when I say we, I refer to a very broad community of academics, experts, strategic experts, thinkers all over the world. We have tended to underestimate in some respect the very important role that Russia can still play in global affairs. And to a very large extent, Russia has been overshadowed by the rise of China and the difficulties that it experienced in the wake of the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. But I think many of us should take note of the fact that Russia is really one country which has enormous internal capacities to sustain itself economically in terms of the access that it has to natural resources, and particularly resources which are going to fetch it strategic returns for decades altogether. Neither China nor India are actually custodian of such kind of natural resources like Russia has. And Russia, of course, because of its history, civilization, the cultural factors, really has the capacity to exert a profound influence on the world. And I think this is a factor which India realizes. And as a result of that, very interestingly, India has made efforts, I think, to keep Russia as engaged as possible. And as you would know, I alluded at one stage in my presentation to the possibility of the Indian and Chinese defense ministers meeting at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is essentially an organization where China and Russia were the two most important members when they began. But now India is a member of that organization as well, along with Pakistan. And this actually gives India the opportunity to not just engage with Russia, but also with Central Asia and the countries of that part of the world, which are very important in terms of the geography they occupy, the strategic positions which they take place. And I would also, like to mention on this occasion that Russia has been the first to officially announce the launch of a COVID-19 vaccine. And India has been one of the countries which has agreed to go for the trials of that vaccine, along with a few other countries in Asia. I think the point over here is very important that for India, I think there is a stage which the country has reached where it realizes that India is no longer a country whose foreign engagement, and when I say foreign engagement, I don't just mean diplomatic engagement, but I mean engagement which is primarily driven by economic considerations and national interests. To an extent, economic considerations have come to determine the character of the diplomatic engagement and foreign policy which a country like India will now have. I think that engagement is no longer decided by a policy of non-alignment, which India used to have in the 70s and 80s before the Cold War. Instead, it has become probably a possible description of that policy could be multi-alignment. India is, in terms of the position and the space that it occupies, in terms of its size, is probably now choosing relationships, each relationship on its own merit. And it clearly realizes that there cannot be a policy which, chooses the United States over Russia and vice versa, because each relationship in its own way for a country like India, which is large, has a value. And I think that is what one gets to see when one also looks at an understanding like the Quad, for example, which you mentioned, that it is important for India to stay engaged with powers, so much so that India remains a country whose views are understood and there is a position to be shared, even if there are certain positions of India which might be confusing to its partners and allies. Now, Professor Carlos, you mentioned this question of the regional comprehensive economic partnership. I think that's where I would like to stress this position, that much as on the foreign policy diplomatic side, India has really pushed on to take a policy of multiple alignments and engaging with various countries. These countries, many of which are India's friends and allies, have actually been disappointed by the lack of proactivity which India has shown when it comes to external trade. And India has shown this rather prominent hesitation to stay out of trade engagements, backing out of free trade agreements, which could be due to certain valid national interests of its own. But I think it's important for India to realize that external engagement has to be comprehensive, and there cannot be diplomatic or strategic engagement minus of economic engagement in a structured fashion. And that is really a disappointment when so far as India's engagement with Southeast Asia and a certain number of other countries are concerned. And this is where I'd like to come on to your second question, that when we talk about decoupling between China and USA, I think the first point to note is that when the United States and China began their tariff war about a couple of years ago, at that time itself, there was some movement out of China insofar as the businesses are concerned, because there were several Chinese businesses or European businesses which were exporting to the United States market from China, who realized that if they continue to do so from China, their products would attract higher duties in the American market. So there was a tendency to relocate to other parts of the region. Similarly, there were American businesses who were working in China but exporting back to the United States of America. They also acted similarly. Now, I think that was a first phase of decoupling which had already happened to a partial extent. The decoupling that we now get to see post-COVID-19 is a decoupling which is driven much more by strategic and political factors rather than economic factors. Now, this is where political and national interests of many countries might converge to a point, and they might agree on the fact that, look, none of us trust China. We are all wary of China's aspirations. We are all wary of the way it is conducting its operations. But that may not necessarily get translated into the way the businesses would want to behave. Because obviously, when businesses have positioned themselves primarily in China and around the region, they have done so on the basis of economic efficiency. And that is an economic efficiency which they continue to obtain. But if today they are asked to give up that efficiency and shift to other locations, they would want some incentives to cover up for this efficiency. A lot would depend upon which location is able to give them what kind of efficiency. For a country like India, this is a very big challenge. It is a very big challenge because India is not yet the best place for doing business in the world, though it has improved considerably over the last 4 to 5 years. When compared with competitive locations in Asia, let's say, for example, a country like Vietnam, India still retains certain major disadvantages, particularly in terms of its internal infrastructure costs, mobility costs, so on and so forth. So when it comes to relocation of production from China, it does not mean that India is an automatic choice. There are several other countries which are going to compete for that relocation when it comes. It will come down to a large number of factors. It will come down to the incentives that national governments can give. It will come down to the incentives or the confidence which these governments are able to generate in the investors who are wanting to move out. And this is where, again, I think the fact that India has been hesitant to engage in trade agreements and larger trade coalitions could be a factor which might work against India. And that is where India needs to really construct a comprehensive dialogue with countries like Japan and Australia, which have a far more outward-oriented, acceptable attitude for the rest of the world as compared with India. So if India is looking to work with them in building resilient supply chains, it really needs to communicate with them far more effectively in looking at opportunities where there could be common rules for attracting investment and repositioning supply chains. So I think when it comes to the larger China-India relationship, I think one needs to accept the fact that when they look at each other, there might be substantial points of disagreement. But when both of them look at the rest of the world, there are obviously challenges which are common for both of them. When, in spite of the great achievements that China has made as an economy, it continues to remain a developing economy. There are still poor people in China. It is yet to reach, in terms of per capita income, the OECD income levels. There are several areas of sustainable development indicators where China is well behind the developed world. And in India's case, there are several shortcomings as well. So I think neither India nor China can afford to overlook the fact that when it comes to development, the situation which they face is in many respects common. Giving access to basic health, public health, and the COVID-19 has exposed the vulnerability in a tremendous sense. That if countries like China and India become victims of pandemic, it can really mean very serious situations for them. So I think down the line, much as they have serious areas of disagreement and they have serious positions on which they will not be able to agree, they still need to find out ways when on global problems, they need to listen to each other, and even on the regional problems, because I think global problems do require China and India working together to the extent possible. And that is not impossible, because if they can work together in providing a common solution to global problems, like they have in the space of climate change, for example, it will only mean good for both of them.
Thanks, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. So now we are going to start with the round of questions. First from the Zoom room chat. Okay, this is a question from Mario Gonzalez. He's asking how Indian media has influenced Narendra Modi's response to China. The ban on Chinese apps in India would probably show an economic strategy by Modi in order to relaunch his Make in India policy.
Thank you for these questions. I think let me share this, that in terms of the reaction to China as far as India is concerned, today, I think popular opinion on China in India is quite negative. And I don't know whether it's a result of the Indian media or it's a result of the very strong anti-China positioning in the Western media. But I think the fact remains that China really does not enjoy a positive reputation in India right now. It was not enjoying such a reputation even before the current standoff. And that, I think, has much to do with the fact that in general, over the last 4 to 5 years, and I would say that particularly since the current leadership has assumed position of prominence in China under Xi Jinping, China has noticeably changed its attitude in engaging with the region and neighbors to a far more aggressive and assertive fashion. And this, for India at least, has got reflected in certain areas with very specific concerns, like, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative did actually affect India the most, and India was the most vocal critic of this because it influenced India's sovereignty in terms of crossing over into the Indian territory. On top of that, India has been wary of the role that China has been played in very active infrastructure building around India in countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and so on and so forth, in assets which India has felt are actually giving Chinese military a decisive advantage with respect to India in spaces like the Indian Ocean and then onto the Himalayas. I think following COVID, there has also been this view that China has not really been very responsible in handling the management of COVID-19, at least as far as sharing information on COVID-19 is concerned. That is a view which is not just held by India. That is a view, I think, which has been held by a number of countries in the world, which has led to pressures on the World Health Organization and calls for an independent inquiry into China's sharing of information on the COVID-19. I think the combination of all these in India has been a fairly strong negative reaction to China, compounded with the fact that there has been this worst military conflict in the last 45 years on the border. What I think India did do is that there was this view on the kind of actions that India can take to convey its displeasure, firstly on account of what India felt was sort of a unnecessary provocation on the border. That's been the Indian perspective. And also the fact that China has probably gone much deep into the Indian economy and society without India and many other countries actually realizing it. And much of this has to do with the digital space in terms of, let's say, for example, phones like Redmi and Xiaomi being extremely popular and sold in India and coming with inbuilt digital content in terms of the TikTok and so on and so forth, which are widely popular apps used by India. And this clearly is the space which is not just the most important future economic space of the world, because India is going to generate huge amount of data. India is going to generate huge amount of digital users in terms of the billions of sort of internet subscribers that it's going to have in the world. But at the same time, this is also an area where the security concerns are fairly strong and they're very difficult to plug. Cybersecurity is clearly not something which is similar to, let's say, land security or marine security or naval security or something like that. I know that personally because I work in the area of international trade, and whenever we look at the question of cross-border trade, particularly with respect to cross-border data, we run into questions that arise with respect to cybersecurity. When data agencies across countries talk among each other, when central banks talk among each other. So I think when it came to Chinese apps, there was this very clear view that, look, this is a space where there is a possibility of external surveillance capturing sensitive data, user data by the Indian citizens and residents, and such data and its access to external agencies might construe a case for a national security concern. So this is something which needs to be acted on. And at the same time, it would also send an economic signal to China that India is not that much economically dependent on China, that it cannot take a strong position, as I mentioned in the past. And yes, it indeed connects to the overall posturing of the Make in India policy. It does, because the Make in India policy is clearly a policy which looks at focusing as much of economic growth in India in-house as possible. However, I would like to submit in this regard that much as it could be a positive policy to implement, I think this is a policy which has a risk of pushing India down the road of external economic isolation if it is carried to an extreme. And that is something which India needs to be careful about, because building internal capacities does not mean disconnecting itself from the rest of the world economically, even if that is China to an extent. I think purely for its own economic interests, it is important for India to retain certain economic links with China, particularly on certain imports, till the time it is able to actually identify alternative sources of import switching and building of internal capacities. So that is a risk that India will have to guard against.
Okay. Now a question from Mr. Sem. He's asking, do you think COVID-19 has accelerated the India-China confrontation, especially about the repositioning of supply and chain dynamics in Asia, given that such trend existed long before in the pandemic? If you do, how so? Thank you.
I think I addressed this question partly when I was responding to Professor Carlos's question on the decoupling between China and yes. Yes, you're absolutely right in the sense that there was already a process of some repositioning of supply chains happening within the Asia Pacific, even before the COVID-19. And that was largely due to the US-China trade war and the tariffs that were being built back and forth. What COVID-19 did was that I think COVID-19 drew attention to the fact that for a country like India, for example, when it comes to essential medical supplies, let's say, for example, even hand sanitizers, pulse oximeters, protective clothing that frontline medical workers require for fighting COVID-19, China continues to remain the major source of imports for all these items. On the other side, if one looks at India's role in the global pharmaceutical industry, India is the world's largest producer of generic drugs. And it sells huge amount of these drugs to the rest of the world. But it is critically dependent on China for the sourcing of the raw materials and bulk drugs, what we call the active pharmaceutical ingredients. Now, once again, what that means is that for the future prospects of the Indian pharma industry, China remains very important as far as a source and supplier of raw materials are concerned. Now, if we look at this in the context of the fact that COVID-19 vaccines are going to become available, let's say in 6 to 12 months or 18 months down the line, and the Indian pharma industry looks at mass production of COVID vaccines for not just its internal consumers, but also for the rest of the world. I think the industry needs to take a serious look at where is it going to access its raw materials and bulk drugs from. If that means that India continues to remain heavily dependent on China for the supply of those upstream material, the dependence remains critical, and India remains a sort of a victim in this supply chain and is unable to respond to the opportunities which its pharma industry might get and unable to respond to the global demands. So I think these are all very complicated understandings which are now being highlighted as a result of the COVID-19 and bringing the challenges that India as an economy and as a country has to look at in a very thorough and hard fashion. This is also not something that just India is looking at closely. These are also challenges that other countries are looking at closely, primarily because of the fact that the world probably never very clearly realized that how much it's got dependent on China in some extent. I remember, since I have worked on the China-India relationship and I have been following China's economy for some time, there is a statistic which I am used to referring in a very anecdotal fashion. And it kind of says that roughly 80% of what all of us use from the time we get up in the morning to the time we go to bed at night is actually made in China in some way or other. I think this is a realization which has finally hit the world hard. That, you know, if this is the degree of dependence that the world has on China, well, obviously the dependence has come because of certain very distinct economic logic. But is it a healthy dependence to persist with? I think that's a question which countries are asking each other, particularly big countries like India.
Thank you. So now we have some questions from Facebook. And we have here one from Mrs. Lia Rodriguez. She's asking, the German government adopted policy guidelines on the Indo-Pacific region, setting out the course for its future policy on the countries of the region. Could you please comment about that?
I have actually not come across the announcement of the German government. So unfortunately, I am not fully aware of what the German government has really articulated in this regard. But what I would like to say is that the Indo-Pacific has increasingly become a very major architecture for not just the Asia-Pacific and Asia, but also for most continents of the world, because the Indo-Pacific is a region of the world which is economically heterogeneous, but at the same time, it comprises the busiest sea routes and the sea traffics, and comprises a huge amount of movement of goods, people, technology, ideas, data, so on and so forth. Big countries like the United States, China, India, Japan, Australia, and even Europe. To that extent, if one visualizes closely, the Europe is actually not too far from Indo-Pacific. So clearly, European countries like Germany, France, I know for sure that the United Kingdom has been very interested in developments around the Indo-Pacific. Sweden and Scandinavia has been trying to look at these developments very closely. The question is that the Indo-Pacific being defined the way it is a historical concept. It also has a fairly strong modern relevance, but till now, the articulation of Indo-Pacific has primarily remained confined to a security-based articulation. It is probably important for this articulation to get a more distinct business orientation, so much so that all others feel interested in joining into the concept.
Okay, and then we have another question from Facebook, from Marcela Victoria. She's asking, domestic reform and economic growth will shape India and China long-term policies? Is it possible to resolve the border issues tensions and the participation of India in the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, I think on the Belt and Road Initiative, India's position has been very clear that the Belt and Road Initiative in its current position and its current orientation passes through a region which is disputed according to India's position. And that is, in a sense, a violation of India's territorial sovereignty. So India cannot really subscribe to that articulation and to that project. On the domestic reforms and the resolution of the border, I think the two are probably separate in the sense that domestic reforms, if essentially it is an idea of economic reforms, then I think India really still has a long ground to cover, because India is a complex country and the economic inefficiencies are also very varied across the country. Much of the reasons for which India has not been able to fully exploit its economic potential are actually domestic. And those factors, insofar as the cost of doing business, the internal infrastructure, the quality of arbitration, the factors that really improve the competitiveness of businesses need to be addressed by India much more rigorously, thoroughly. This is where not just China, but many other countries of Southeast Asia and South America have actually done much better than India. So it is very important for India to address this urgently. Otherwise, it might not continue to remain an effective beneficiary of the supply chain repositioning strategy as is being worked out. As far as the border issue is concerned, well, again, I'm not really sure whether the border issue does have any prospects for resolution, but I think ultimately it has to come down to a question of a political will. This is obviously a situation where neither side is really in a position to concede. But whether without conceding a satisfactory resolution can be achieved or not is a different question.
Yes, thank you, Professor. So we have one more question. I don't know if we still have time. I will read anyway. So from Mario Gonzalez, he says the border issue is still a driver of India-China relationships. So why Indian government holds its traditional position on have open and transparent negotiations with China instead of secret conversation. Israel, a democracy like India, had to have secret conversations with Egypt to achieve a peace treaty.
Well, I don't know whether it's a question of being secretive, which necessarily is the secret of success for resolving border disputes. But I think the Indian tradition has always been to go into dialogue, and the dialogues have been transparent as much as possible. But having said that, I think when it comes to discussions on borders, they are not secret, but they're clearly not public as well. And I think these are conversations like most other G2G conversations, which take place behind closed doors. And obviously, one cannot have the public participating in such conversations. But at the same time, I think from an Indian side and from the sides of other partners with whom it negotiates, there has always been this tradition of issuing joint statements which are mutually agreed upon. So I think it's also important for the people and the public at large to know that what exactly is happening with respect to these consultations, because ultimately it is the public which is influenced the most as a result of these decisions.
Okay, thank you. So now I give the floor to Professor Aquino. He wants to say some words.
Thanks, Maria. No, just I guess we have taken a lot of time from Professor Amitendu. Palit says, Professor, you are very kind of attending our petition, and I think it's very late at night there. Anyway, it was very, very interesting. You have covered, as I said before, all the topics, a very comprehensive account of what's going on among these two big countries. And we hope we can have you again talking about this tema, because it's developing, or about other temas. You study many things in Asia. For example, this economic integration in East Asia, which you are also an expert, is a very interesting tema that we also want to touch. As I said before, probably at the end of November, the next meeting of this RCP, perhaps they will reach an agreement, sadly without India, and then we could talk about that. What are the implications of that RCP that was supposed to compete with the American-led before Trump signed out the participation of the United States. But anyway, that will be very interesting tema, for example, to compare this TPP and the new RCP. Thanks, Professor. You are very kind.
No, thank you so much, Professor Carlos. Thank you so much, Professor Maria. I think it's been a wonderful experience for me. Thank you so much for inviting me to the conference. I learned a lot out of the questions that were asked, and it's really improved my knowledge. And at one level, I would also want to share with you my willingness to collaborate with your university and your center with respect to my center. So I'll be open to having such discussions with you whenever the opportunity arises. And at another level, I'm very happy to get the opportunity of coming back to you again whenever such opportunity arises. So please let me know. And I wish you all the very best. And most importantly, stay safe, and hope to see you soon virtually, and maybe in the near future someday physically, whether in Asia or in South America.
Perhaps now, Professor, when things get to normal. Thanks everybody. Just to finish it, let me give an announcement. Today at 7 p.m. we have another conference. Sorry, Professor, I will tell it in Spanish because it's in Spanish. We're going to have, vamos a tener a las 7 de la noche una conferencia sobre cine hecho por mujeres en Japón, del grupo Futari. Están invitados hoy día a las 7 de la noche. Y por último, el día miércoles vamos a tener una conferencia del embajador de México sobre el nuevo Tratado de Libre Comercio entre México, Estados Unidos, Canadá y de Alianza del Pacífico. I was telling Professor, sorry, in Spanish, we're going to have the conference today, but on this next week, on September 9, we're going to have a very interesting conference given by the ambassador of Mexico in Peru. He's going to talk about this new FTA signed between, and that is in effect between Mexico, United States, and Canada, and also about the Pacific Alliance, you know, this group of four South American countries. Sorry, it's in
Right.
Spanish. If you cannot, we're very nice. Thank you, Professor, again.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody. See you again.
Too. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good day.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Gracias, María. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Gracias, embajador. Gracias, profesor. Kiasan Lim.